Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Madhouse podcast. I'm your host, Gabriel Mundaka. I have lovely conversations with creative people in Africa artists, designers, engineers, and people find creative ways to do their work. We explore what drives them, how they overcome challenges, and what it really means to live a creative life. If this is your kind of vibe, welcome to the Madhouse. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so that you don't miss an episode. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Enjoy the episode.
Okay. And my view was, look, for God's sake, when you're on a successful role like that, don't change your name. Okay. And the gains, I think, to being the first mover there, undoubtedly, African food is starting to break through.
So I wanted to start with a very interesting fact. I did some research when I was kind of trying to talk to you, and I was laughing that your wife is a vicar
Mm.
and my mother is a reverend, and I was like laughing because my mom gets stressed about I was like I wonder if Rory stresses his wife like I stress my mother because sometimes these crazy ideas I'm sitting down and I'm going like, this is very interesting. Like recently, I think we were talking to my mother about like if Nero wasn't Christian, it wouldn't be as cool as it is now. And it was just like this whole debate about about Christian faith and all these things. And I was wondering, that's
No. I mean, I occasionally wind my wife up by saying that if it wasn't for St. Paul, no one would have heard of Jesus, which is, on the importance of marketing. Any religion actually is, principally, it's a marketing success. And, there have been, I'm sure, lots and lots, there were indeed lots and lots of prophets around at the time, as indeed you see in films like The Life of Brian, but they didn't manage to, now obviously, but there is, it's fundamentally about persuasion. And by the way, persuasion's slow. I think we always forget this. Now, what you will start seeing happening in Africa, I think, and this is, by the way, a bit unfair, but it may be the countries that break through. It isn't the continent that breaks through first. It's one or two countries. So people will still maintain their perception that Africa isn't so good, but they'll say, except for Botswana, which is fantastic, or except for Zambia, or except for Uganda. Okay. And so, that tends to happen, which is that individual countries, suddenly get a kind of hall pass. But by the way, the extent to which national branding is really, really relevant is interesting. I mean, one interesting thing in the West is that undoubtedly African food is starting to break through. So we've always had Indian food, but it's in London. If you wanted to open a restaurant now, funnily enough, I was in Manchester at the weekend and we went to an Eritrean restaurant, which was fantastic, absolutely brilliant food. And that's one interesting. And by the way, I mean, food. I spoke to someone who is involved in African development who said that part of the thing that's a problem is that everybody wants to move to the cities and go to university. And the biggest immediate opportunity for Africa is agriculture, which is, the quality of produce, the climate you have in many countries, it varies hugely from one country to another, but you get absolute, abundance of fantastic food. And so, that will be a really, that's a really interesting export opportunity right now. I think. But you're right that the national. I mean, I spent basically 15 years getting angry in Britain because everybody was always talking up China and not talking up India, which used to really annoy me because I went, well, look, India's kind of like a democracy, right? It's a much more organic marketplace and it's a much more organic form of capitalism than Chinese capitalism, which is kind of state controlled and, to some extent, what you might call artificially accelerated. Whereas India's growth is organic. The Indian economic growth, which was only 1 or 2% less per year than China's, India's growth was organic. And until now, suddenly you have Apple desperate to get phones manufactured somewhere other than
true.
Somewhere other than China, because they realize it's a sort of systemic risk, the extent to which they're dependent on Chinese manufacturing. And it's only now where people are starting to go, God, what's India been doing all these years? Because everybody's attention was focused on China. And it was deeply unfair. I thought it was deeply unfair, actually. It was just wrong. The great thing is, one great thing is that you can export, just as I said, actually, agriculture and fine fruit and so forth are an export opportunity. Creativity is a spectacular export opportunity. So you're beginning to see that with Ghanaian music in Ghana, for example, is absolutely huge. Interesting question in Africa is which is the country that becomes the creative heartland, because Korea to some extent has become the kind of, no one would have predicted this. No one would have predicted K-pop and Korea being, and filmmaking and the Oscar for Parasite. No one would have predicted Korea being the creative hub for Southeast Asia, 20 years ago. It would have seemed completely unlikely. And that the opportunity to export that is huge, because it's fabulous. And I would love to see this, by the way. I'd really, really love to see, great advertising winning at Cannes. We've already seen that in Tunisia. But actually, you start to see optimistic stories about African economic recovery. You start to see them in places like The Economist and the Wall Street Journal. And as I said, general perception. So I mentioned the fact that some countries may suddenly be seen as outliers and exceptions, in the way that in India it was Bangalore, which was the, people,
like you're right, like, sorry.
That's interesting. So,
right, like Rwanda, for instance. Rwanda is one of those that seems to be standing out.
Yes,
quite well.
Absolutely. So Rwanda, you might get Botswana. You might actually, not impossible, you'd find it in Zambia or somewhere similar. Ghana wouldn't surprise me, for example, at all. And what you'll start to see is one or two places become kind of known as hubs for something. And the gains, I think, to being the first mover there, just as they were, I mean, the crazy thing that they did in Bangalore is, for reasons, I think, of Modi nationalism, they renamed Bangalore Bengaluru. Okay. And my view was, look, for God's sake, when you're on a successful roll like that, don't change your name. Okay. Because, imagine what it's worth in millions of dollars to have, a random guy in California. If you said, what is the tech capital of India? They'd answer Bangalore. Well, what's that worth? It's worth millions, But it would be really, really interesting. And there's no reason actually why app development, fashion is another area. Oops.
The Internet of Africa. We're getting there. Yeah, hopefully.
No, but having said that, sometimes I've had brilliant internet calls with people in Africa, and I've had terrible calls with people in Silicon Valley. So it's not necessarily a generalizable thing.
Yeah, but there's usually like a perception of like, hey, this internet in Africa is not as fast. It's like it's the same internet. But yeah, sometimes I guess. Do
you have M-Pesa? Because there are mobile payments. Mobile payments were well ahead of the West in.
So for where I'm in Kampala, there's MTN. MTN has something called mobile.
Yes.
Money, which is the same to like M-Pesa. M-Pesa is really like.
It's the same basic principle.
But the same idea, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's really.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I wanted you to introduce.
So no, I mean that's.
Sorry, I was saying, I'd wanted a small.
So I thought Uganda, because Uganda has fantastic agricultural opportunities. You have again in cultural terms. One of the things that would really interest me would be fashion, because I've got the fashion sense in Africa. The creative approach to fashion is fabulous, and I can see that spreading. By which I mean, I think people are kind of, people must have got a bit bored with, to some extent, what you might call, French, Italian high-end fashion.
Couture.
And I can completely see the emergence of a Ugandan fashion brand, for instance.
Yes, that, and there are a couple coming through which are quite impressive. I guess small brands doing some very interesting small things within the space, which
it'd be very interesting. It'd be very interesting because I mean, you've got. Let me see. Your population is probably what, about 1.5 million? Is it in Kampala, something like that? Which is a great size for a city. It's on 2, is it? Yeah,
I
fantastic.
don't trust that number, but let's keep going. Because it should be more than 1.5, but sure, yeah.
And so it's also you have, again, obviously there's tourism, which is growing.
Yes.
That's an interesting question, which is how much do you want it to grow? Because you don't want to become, obviously you've got, Lake Victoria and so forth, but you obviously don't want there to be, I wouldn't recommend becoming a tourist economy, personally.
Yeah. Oh, why? So because here.
Well, no. It's great. It's great. No. You want tourism to grow, and you want tourism to grow at a manageable rate. But it does always scare me that now, obviously, if you're an island economy, it makes obvious sense.
Okay.
But if you've got a larger population, there is an argument that you want to balance out the economy a bit and have architecture, creative industries, for example. You want a mix of industries. If you become primarily known as a tourist destination, now you might argue, well, it brings in hard currency. It's a fairly quick way to enrich yourself. You've got a fantastic climate because, if I'm right, you've got relatively cool places. In other words, the elevation is fairly high, isn't it? Okay.
Yeah, it is in some spaces.
You've obviously got, you've got an awful lot there, which is interesting. So the only question is that if you become overwhelmingly a tourist economy, it always strikes me that it might distort people's aspirations because everybody then wants to work in tourism. Just as actually international aid can distort people's aspirations. Because someone was telling me, I'm just trying to remember. Now, do you have that very interesting thing called, I'm fairly sure I'm right, which is a brilliant comic strip and radio program. Am I right about this? I think it's Ugandan. Oh, crikey. It's not called Fugaz or something, is it? Let me just remember. No, hold on. Let me go and find it out. Sorry, pause for a second.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah. What's it called?
I'll find it. I'm just trying to remember which country it's in, which is a... here we are. I'll find it in a second. Shujaz. It's in East Africa. I know that much. But where is? No, you don't have it. Oh, it's Tanzanian. It's Kenyan. It's Kenyan Tanzanian. So in Kenya and Tanzania, it reaches 56% of young Kenyans and 24% of young Tanzanians.
Nice.
And it's a huge youth brand. I'm sorry, I thought it had spread to Uganda. Maybe that's
No.
Maybe that's the plan for next year. I knew it had started in Kenya, but it's all about a 19-year-old. It's about a radio DJ and influencer, but it's also useful because it creates kind of Shujaz heroes, which actually encourages entrepreneurialism. Because that's the reason I worry about tourism, and the reason I worry about probably too much. And I also worry about certain forms of employment, is that if everybody aspires to work for, a hotel brand, for example, what ultimately you need is a lot of entrepreneurialism to get started. Yeah. And so Shujaz, sorry, I knew I remembered the name. You can investigate it actually, because I think it's available online.
Okay, I'll check it out.
But one of the valuable things it does is it just encourages entrepreneurialism among the young. And makes the point that you can start a business rather than necessarily aspiring to work for somebody else.
I see. That's
but it will. I mean, obviously, the creative industries are definitely a fast opportunity. No doubt at all about that. It'd be great, I mean, I think there's probably distinctive architecture which could be, done well
It,
in many ways.
so
And there could be some really interesting stuff in the world of design as well.
yeah,
And
yeah. And
again,
also
I
the very
mean,
many.
hello.
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry, I was wondering if you can hear me.
Yes, I can
Can you
perfectly.
hear
Yes,
me?
perfectly. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Can
Yeah,
you? Yeah.
I was saying you were saying adoption of Shujas. Kampala is in East Africa tends to be the slowest at adoption for new things sometimes. So like we really take our time before like something really, really sets into the space. That's usually the Ugandan things. Like takes a time to like, oh, it never even really comes. So
Mm.
it's usually I don't know why it's a thing, but it usually does here. But you mentioned something about agriculture, and I was laughing because I think I was having a conversation I think with my parents, and we were talking about like agriculture used to work when I think we used to have our colonial connection to like Britain, and it
Mm.
was easy to like sell sell sugar and cotton to a market, and now I think it's a challenge ever since like that connection or that connection to a market was sort of cut off or it's harder to enter as it is now, that I feel like what you're saying of creativity being a much more the barrier to entry is
Notionally,
easier. Yeah,
the barrier to entry is very, very low. And
yeah,
there was a great Ugandan film made, wasn't there? That was on YouTube, which was like an adventure film
yes, yeah,
that
yeah.
recently went up. What was that called? It was really good. I watched it.
Was it 16 rounds? Was it 16 rounds that you had seen?
Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
was it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So yeah, my
it
friend
was about a
recently showed
kidnapping,
it.
wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes, yeah,
Oh, he
16
shot
rounds.
that.
Yeah. No,
Oh, fantastic! We
I
see. I've seen that.
yes, so I shot the documentary for it. So the making of it, that's what I did. I will share a link with you maybe after, and you can check it out. But I did the documentary for the making of it. Yeah, but it's a friend of mine here who shot it, which is it's pretty cool. Yeah, but
I mean,
someone
I
like
mean,
him, yes,
no, it was. I mean, my brother-in-law recommended it to me, and he's in the film industry in the UK. So I mean, it's getting
nice.
traction.
Nice. That's
And
good to hear. Yeah,
but that's the interesting thing, which is you don't have what always happened with agriculture is you got ripped off by intermediaries.
yeah, very true.
And if
Yeah,
you can now find ways of selling, of using the disintermediation of the internet to sell directly, there's
yeah,
something I
on
think
sugar.
potentially really interesting there. Yeah.
Yeah,
So if you sell direct to the consumer, I noticed that in India, Modi's doing a very clever thing internally within India, which is creating a
nice.
kind of Indian eBay. And I think he's also creating a
Nice.
kind of Indian payment platform to facilitate trade because he's a fairly active. He's fairly active. I mean, in a sense, India has benefited, whatever you think of Modi, and I
Yes.
don't have an opinion, but I simply know that my Indian friends tend to be very divided by him.
By him.
There's
Yeah,
the nationalism question, and there's the economic
yeah,
question.
yeah.
But a lot of countries probably suffered from having a kind of anti-business culture for a long,
Mm,
long time.
yes, yeah,
Typically after independence.
yeah,
And India undoubtedly suffered from having this kind of non-aligned thing.
yeah,
And for example, uh, they banned Coca-Cola and sort of foreign imports, and
yeah.
that probably was. It's not. By the way, I'm not suggesting complete free trade because you can end up doing
Yeah,
very badly out of that. But the opportunity to actually trade, and Modi has this interesting idea of a kind of Indian-style eBay, I think, which
nice.
now I think that can become quite an interesting export market because all you need is good
Mm,
distribution. The
yeah.
UK is arguably back on the table after Brexit. Technically, the European Union isn't. I mean, technically, the European Union is supposed not to impose duties on imports from the developing world, agricultural
Yeah,
imports from the developing
yeah,
world. How
yeah.
true that is in reality, I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Yeah. Plus
But
also
but
like
the UK is
the
definitely back on the
standards.
table.
Yeah. Yeah. Plus also like standards kind of gets tricky sometimes. Like where it's like almost like those barriers to
Yeah.
entry to agriculture, where it's like someone really puts in their work to sell tomatoes, and then you reach them to like these tomatoes do not pass the something, and it's like oh, so yeah, it's
No,
really
you get a lot of regulatory capture, so the standards are kind of set by large manufacturers in Europe,
Yes.
generally
Yeah.
to their own advantage. And so, yeah, that's dodgy, no doubt about it. Sorry, I don't know
So
what's happened with this camera. I'll try and get it to behave normally, but it's behaving very strangely. I might turn it off and turn it on again. But I'll just turn it off briefly and then see if we get a bit of sense out of it.
Yeah.
Oh no, it's doing this. Okay, let me try holding my hand up to it. But no, it's yeah. I don't know why it's done this, and I have no clue why it's suddenly decided to. Oh dear. Okay, I'll if I turn it off again, we can just talk for a bit. But no, I can see big opportunities there in terms of creative export. The fashion industry, the music industry are both gifts in a sense, potentially. It's now gone to my other camera, I expect, but I'll change the settings. Here we go. Let's see if I turn it back. That's better. I'm back in the room.
Yeah.
There's now it's turned itself off. Now it's doing something even stranger. Don't worry. Anyway, it seems to work. But I think there's something really. I think that's interesting. The other great thing is, as I said, is that artificially, I know, and I don't like it, but some countries are going to get the reputation first. In that, for some reason, when people change their minds about something, they tend to do it a bit gradually rather than, they tend to do it kind of like, well, no, that's bad, but this bit of it is good. Yeah. And so, and then the other thing I say is that, as I said, it's painfully slow. But I mean, if you think about it, you've got Nigeria with a population of about 200 million. It's pretty enormous, isn't it? It'd be surprising, if that doesn't actually. You also have a fantastic educational culture, generally. Yeah. In other words, there's also tremendous levels of curiosity, which I think is really important and impressive. There's incredible energy. You have fantastic demographics, okay? Yes. In that, just as the rest of the developed world gets far too old, China gets absurdly old because of their one-child policy. So Chinese demographics are kind of a shit show, okay? If you think Japan's bad, I mean, China's inordinately worse. Because, of course, you can't create young people. It takes 20 years to make a 20-year-old, So, if China wants to actually restore its demography, and also you get bad demography because of urbanization, which is that when people move into the cities, they have far fewer children. Because as that guy, I don't know if you ever watched Peter Zeihan.
No, I haven't seen it.
But it'd be very interesting to see what Peter Zeihan would have to say about different African countries. He's a really interesting speaker. I don't agree with everything he says, but it's always highly opinionated and very well argued and very interesting.
Okay.
And he would probably argue that there are certain countries which, by dint of geography and demography, have really significant advantages. You also have, if you have an educational culture, that helps. If you have oil, that can be a huge disadvantage, of course, because it's kind of it's an artificial industry which makes your currency higher, but then as a consequence, makes it difficult for you to export anything else. I think that's known as the Dutch disease, because the Dutch had a lot of natural gas, which drove up their currency. And then meant it became harder and harder for the Dutch to export anything that wasn't energy. And so there are these incredible pitfalls. But equally, if you have, if the institutions settle down and people eventually find that getting rich honestly is ultimately a better wealth generator than getting wealthy dishonestly, because that image of corruption, by the way, which is not always true, okay, it's sometimes true. But it permeates a lot, that feeling, which is, well, what's the point of starting a business somewhere if it just gets taken away from me, or if I can't get the money out, or if, effectively, if half my profits have to be paid to someone to allow the business to keep going. Those kind of fears, they weren't irrational fears 20 or 30 years ago, undoubtedly,
Yeah, it almost reminds me of what you just said. I don't know if you know a lady called Margaret Wade, who sort of has been pushing for. Was been pushing was been talking about like Africa changing its over regulation on business, so that encourages more entrepreneurship and more interesting ideas to sort of.
Is she Ugandan? Is she?
No, she's from, I think, Ghana, Botswana, one of those French-speaking African countries. I forget.
Aha.
But she has some very interesting ideas. Where
No,
it's
I
like,
mean,
and I've always been thinking like, hey, I think if she tapped into the creative industries, what she's trying to push for, would
yes.
be easier than manufacturing or agriculture, but like film, music, it may be easier to pull that stuff that she's trying to do easy, quickly.
There's also a really weird idea, but
Yeah.
which a lot of people don't like, but it's interesting. Okay. And there's an economist who was, I think, the chief economist for the World Bank for a time. And I'm fairly sure he got the Nobel Prize for Economics as well. And his idea, and I'll just find, I've met him, we're ridiculous. Now I can't remember his name. Let me just, here we are. I'll find his name. He's called Paul Romer. And his idea, he's founded a thing called the Charter Cities Institutes.
Yeah.
And he argues that what places like Africa need is kind of cities a bit like Hong Kong, which this may be what Margaret's talking about to an extent, where you have there's an area of Dubai, for example, which runs on British law. And Hong Kong undoubtedly was instrumental in the enrichment of China, because a lot of the talent that actually went in and started businesses in China was either Taiwanese or Hong Kongese.
Yeah.
And Paul Romer's idea, and I think he runs a thing called the Charter Cities Institute, and there's a TED talk which he gave, which I actually saw live, which is all about charter cities, which is you have cities that effectively, typically they'd be ports, or they'd at least have railway access so they could trade widely. And they operate as kind of entrepreneurial beacons outside the main legislative framework of the country itself. So Dubai, bizarrely, there's a chunk of Dubai which runs on British law for financial transactions because it's simply much easier to do it that way.
Okay.
And so Paul Romer leads this thing, which is the Charter Cities Institute. And it has to be said that it's kind of an interesting idea that, you know, if you think about it, had India had a kind of a single port somewhere with a population of, he argues that countries are too large to make this happen, to make this change happen, and that towns are too small. But a single city can be a kind of catalyst for entrepreneurialism in the entire catchment area.
Yeah.
And so I mean, Paul Romer, R-O-M-E-R, he's a really eminent guy. Now, I think a lot of people, to be honest, possibly not the Brits, when I saw him give the talk in TED, but particularly the Americans saw it as a kind of a little bit in the danger of becoming a bit of a colonial project. But it's absolutely not like that, in that if you look at the population of Hong Kong, the population of Hong Kong was always overwhelmingly Chinese. It just operated, I'm so sorry, the phone was ringing. It just operated according to different conditions. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be that the conditions have to be better, but having different conditions. I'm sorry, I'm just going to get this.
Hey, sorry, as Rory is on the phone, I would like to talk about something. CreativeAsylum.com. Stay in the loop with Africa's Creative Pulse. Sign up for our monthly newsletter for the latest updates, upcoming projects, and exclusive podcast episodes. Don't miss out. Join our community of innovators and storytellers today. Okay, you know what? Bye. Enjoy the rest of the episode. Peace.
Yeah, I haven't used them all. Don't worry. Okay. Bye-bye. Oh, sorry about that.
No, let's go. I guess
there we go.
We can use this for the promo.
We'll use that for the promo. Exactly. We be on the phone. Yeah. But no, I mean, the Charter Cities idea is interesting because if it can be made to work, I genuinely believe he's right that you just need to, in some cases, you just need, separate conditions, and it's very empirically driven. He's looked at cases where it's obviously worked. It works brilliantly in many ways for trade because if you have a port, it effectively acts as a kind of interface between the legal system of one country and the legal system of another. Yeah. But also what you typically would find is it would become a creative hub as well. You know, if you guarantee things like, freedom of speech and freedom of expression and so forth, generally it's very interesting. And also I notice, a little bit with Cape Town in South Africa, is that creative people generally like living by the coast a bit, but
warm weather and water.
Of course, the other one is simply the other thing, which I'd be crazy not to talk about, is the importance of Zoom, which is that what the pandemic did is it taught everybody how to effectively meet face to face remotely. Now, one of the things that annoys me is that the economic importance of the widespread adoption of video conferencing, I would suggest, could become immense, because there's no reason why you can't share your expertise, okay? Or work on digital projects. I think before Zoom came in and before Teams came in, now I'm always conscious of the fact that I look like an idiot proposing video conferencing because the technology is 30 years old. Okay. What isn't old, however, is the fact that it feels normal using it. And so I've had conversations with people, which would never have happened, before the pandemic. Nice. Someone in Peru I spoke to, someone in a remote town in Argentina. In other words, the likelihood that we're going to meet face to face is minimal. I mean, we might eventually. Okay, if they ever come to London, I'll then meet them physically. Or if I ever end up in Peru, I'll happily go and see them. But I'm never going to get permission to go and fly down to Peru to see them, nor am I going to get permission to fly to Kampala to meet you to record a podcast. But we can do this online. I don't have to ask anybody for permission. It just happens. So the extent to which I think you can actually export, expertise. You can export, entertainment and so forth. All those things that are intangibles. The other opportunity, of course, is becoming a centre, if you get the internet sorted, is becoming a centre for remote work as well. That's potentially really interesting.
It reminds me of this.
So places that have done that in Europe, for example, Lisbon's done it very successfully in Europe. The island of Madeira. I think it was Barbados during the pandemic, which basically just said, come and work here. Just said, if you're going to be stuck in a pandemic, why don't you get stuck on the beach in Barbados rather than stuck in a one-bedroom apartment in London? And so a few countries have been very clever at really reaching out to nomad and workers, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it reminds me of what the VFX houses in Soho did in London, where they sort of just set up themselves to be in the same space, which I found very interesting.
Yes.
I think the Mill and all these NPCs were in the same area, and it sort of created the Soho network, which was I read the history of Soho Network. I was like, that's what you guys did. And I thought when he said small town and what Mark was doing, I think it's something, I think also us on the continent creatively can sort of think of going hey, what if there's this high speed network between these areas that serves this need, whether it's for music or for fashion or just general creativity, and just feeds a thing. But
I can completely see fashion taking off. There would be nothing would make me happier than to see an Indian or African country start to take on Louis Vuitton, LVMH, or the big luxury brands,
or take over the fashion weeks.
Because exactly, exactly that. Nothing would make me happier than that, because I think it's it's obviously harder for men's clothes maybe than for women's clothes, but women's clothes, have drawn extraordinary acts of cultural appropriation from, Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was an act of appropriation of African masks. Okay. There have been extraordinary acts of appropriation from African culture. Appropriation isn't always bad. It's better to be copied than to be ignored. I'm not totally, I'm not totally attacking it. If you have a great creative idea, you want it to spread.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the gains have not gone to where in many cases the economic gains have not gone to the place where the work was done.
Yes. Yeah.
and that's always I think problematic.
And which is very interesting, because in Africa it always seems like we have the idea, but protecting it is sometimes feels like a challenge for us. Like where it's like, for instance, I would say like Afrobeats is now like the sound of the world right now. It's like everyone is really enjoying this African
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
But
is that from Ghana? Is it principally, or is it
Nigeria?
Did that originate in Ghana? Nigeria, is it? Got it, yeah.
It's a mix.
And you have Nollywood in Nigeria.
Yeah. And like it's like how do we protect those ideas so that then the economics make sense for us back home, as compared to like where it's like Nigerian artist gets famous, but he's signed under maybe a big Universal Music, and now he's always in Europe and the West and never back home, and he gets, so it becomes really an interesting thing. And I wanted to know what your thoughts are about, I guess, like protection and things like having more, I guess, is it ownership and right? Like, I don't know if it's a thing you've thought.
Yeah, I mean that whole question of stopping your work getting stolen is really, really important, and I think, I mean, one would hope now. That I'm mixed on the whole plagiarism thing, because sometimes all creative artists to some extent borrow from other influences. Not many people are 100% original, but at the same time, if you can't protect your work, or if effectively people just end up in a different continent, that's a pity. And one would hope, and of course, there are huge cases where the mobile telephony has been an extraordinary economic benefit. Simple things like communication. One of the interesting things in India, which fascinates me, is that effectively, I think Amazon can deliver to 98% of the Indian population within a few days. Oh, wow. And it's interestingly because the postal service is still very trusted. I don't quite understand I don't quite understand. I tried to research it a bit, but if you research for Indian and postman, for some reason you get quite a lot of pornography, because apparently the postman fulfills the same role in Indian pornography as the pizza delivery guy does in kind of American pornography, okay, or the plumber or whatever it might be. But nonetheless, there seems to be some system where because I know that in India they use the postal service as a kind of cash machine. So you go online and you basically say, I need some cash. I need the postman to deliver me so many thousand rupees. And the postman comes along with the money and gives it to you. And for whatever reason, nobody interferes with this. Oh, wow. It's completely respected and trustworthy. And so that's, I often think actually that is a really important question, which is really basic infrastructure, basic trusted infrastructure in post telecommunications and everything else. I made the point the other day that you couldn't really have had the railways in the UK to the extent you did without the penny post being invented first. Because in order to meet people, you had to arrange where you were meeting. You can't just turn up on someone's doorstep 100 miles away and say, I was planning to stay for 3 days. I mean, they might not be there, or they might not want you. Okay. Yeah. But the fact that you had letters, a fairly fast letter delivery service, which basically worked. Yeah. Those kind of infrastructural things, I think, are really, really important. What happens as well is I've got to be careful because I've got to go in 5 minutes because I've just got something else at 6. What often happens is, actually the other thing about Africa is it's kind of cool. And one of the things I see always happening, it's pretty, it's pretty cool, okay. And one of the things I always see happening in fashions is there's a kind of cool, rich trade-off, which is it's hard to be really rich and still be cool. Okay. Yeah. And so you get this in property in London, okay, which is you get the rich area, and then the rich area becomes so rich, it's no longer cool anymore. Okay. And actually what happens is all the artisan coffee shops close down and you just get high-end boutiques selling kind of, Versace underpants or whatever. Okay. Yeah. And at that point, the tragedy is that something's died, that the wealth has actually killed off. Cool is too narrow a definition, but you know what I mean? The vibe. Yeah. The vibe's killed by too much wealth. Yeah. And then what happens is the vibe the cool people move somewhere else, and they move to Brooklyn, or they move to Shoreditch, or they do something else. And that then you have this weird thing. I'm sure I wouldn't surprise me at all if not among rich foreign buyers, but among rich Americans, Brooklyn actually becomes more desirable than Manhattan. Well, it already is in parts, actually. Apart from anything else, it's got a better view of Manhattan than Manhattan has.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't surprise me if, other than the absolute uber wealthy, actually what you find happening is that, and then what happens is eventually Brooklyn will become so rich, which has probably happened already in parts of Brooklyn, I don't know it well enough, that those parts stop being cool and people have to discover something else.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And there's a chance, there is always a chance there that, okay, well, it's better to be rich than cool in many ways. Okay, I'll accept that. But there's always that second opportunity, which is we can't actually outspend these people, but we can outcool them. And I always think there's a kind of strategy. I mean, to be honest, that's what Apple did. Okay. Okay,
everyone.
You had IBM as the dominant player, and you had Microsoft, and they were really rich. And then actually, what they really did is they basically went and said, "Yeah, that's okay, but it's not cool." Okay, and they produced effectively. It's a ridiculous thing to say artisan software. It was kind of artisan, handcrafted software, which people liked. You get that in food. Yeah, no, absolutely. Just outcool everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, just be like.
Because actually, it's. I agree. And actually, the inventiveness, and also there are fields also where you can make very fast progress. It's very slow to make progress in complicated, in chip manufacturing. It's difficult.
Yeah.
Okay.
But like in music.
But if you, but in music or in food, okay, they're fast moving. They're fast feedback as well.
Yes,
in that you can fail fast and realize, okay, cassava. Do you have a lot of that in Uganda as a food?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do.
Is it mogu? Because that's totally underrated food stuff. Okay, it's fantastic, right? The cassava, and yet most people, seriously. We had Meghan Markle claiming that you can't get avocados in Britain. That's rubbish. We've had avocados for years. Okay, I don't know where she got the idea you couldn't get avocados from. But cassava, they're foodstuffs, okay? Yeah. I had a guy who came to me from Zimbabwe, I think, whose great thing was baobab.
Ah, nice.
It's extraordinarily interesting. The baobab seed, unbelievably interesting thing. And then a company in South Africa started making baobab gin, for instance.
Ah, nice. Yeah.
And what I said to him was, I said, look, some of these trees are 1,000 years old. Okay.
Yeah.
Harvest the baobab separately from trees that are over 1,000 years old and sell it as 1,000-year-old baobab, right?
Yeah, nice.
Because who doesn't want to buy food from a tree that was basically, the tree was just about starting to grow at the time of the Norman Conquest. That's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And actually, that's my other point, because I've only got 4 minutes left. Actually, what we always forget, I mentioned that no one would have heard of Jesus if it wasn't for St. Paul, that actually great ideas need marketing. It's not enough to be great in itself, okay? Yeah. You've got to persuade people to try it. And people are creatures of habit. People copy each other. And actually, if there were a baobab or a cassava marketing board, there's this Indian dish. I go to an Indian restaurant near Dover. Fantastic. Mogu something or other. A highly spiced cassava dish. One of the most delicious things I've ever eaten. Nice. I go, well, why isn't this everywhere? It's fantastic. Not sweet potatoes, I think, are rubbish. I don't understand the appeal at all. But this cassava thing was fantastic.
Yeah. So,
and I just kept thinking the same thing.
Sorry.
So is there actually, should you pick a couple of countries, and the UK after Brexit would be an obvious one, but maybe you pick the United States, maybe you pick California or somewhere.
Yeah.
And you just, you just see if you can just blitz a couple of geographies with marketing for something and see what happens.
Nice. Yeah. So since you're about to run, I thought usually in the podcast, I usually ask the guests one life lesson that they think people can go with. Yeah. In case before you run.
Yeah, I usually give, I'll give you one, which is a really easy one. I often say be good at two things. but actually spend some time working in a shop or a restaurant.
Yeah.
Because if you've worked in a shop or you've worked in a cafe or you've worked in a restaurant, you understand the whole of business. It's like an MBA, except they pay you to do it. Okay? Because a shop has everything. It has supply, it has logistics, it has finance, it has accounting, it has marketing, it has, customer loyalty, it has customer experience. A shop is everything in one thing.
Yeah.
And so I often think that actually, if you can spend some time, if you grow up in a shop, if your parents run a shop, one of the great things about that is you basically get to understand a bit of everything.
Okay, yeah, that's nice. That's
true.
Yep.
And I always notice that you get a lot of very successful entrepreneurs in the UK, often from sort of second generation immigrant families. And why are they so successful? Well, I think part of the reason, there are lots of reasons, but part of the reason is that they grew up in a shop. Our Prime Minister effectively grew up in a shop. I think his mother was a pharmacist,
nice.
And it just teaches you something about how to think in a systems way rather than thinking in a kind of mechanistic silo way. And I think that's probably my one bit of advice.
Nice. Rory, I know you have to run. Thank you so much. I guess we'll go.
I know not to. I won't close the thing until if you stop recording now, we can do the upload, and it should upload fairly quickly.